All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the webinar Mycoast in Action. I would like to thank Georgia Young, Rhode Island Sea Grant Communications Fellow, who's going to help co-host this evening in case there's any technical glitches. And I'd also like to thank Thais Fournier, who's also helping to co-host this evening. She's a coastal resilience specialist with the URI Coastal Resources Center and Rhode Island Sea Grant. And I should say that I'm Monica Allard-Cox, the Communications Director for Rhode Island Sea Grant. So you've gotten a lot of emails from me about tonight, so thank you for your patience. If you have any questions for any of our presenters, please enter those into the chat. We will answer those at the end of the presentations. Tonight, Thais is going to introduce what Mycoast is, tell us a little bit about it for those of you who are not familiar with Mycoast, and then she's going to introduce our two presenters. So take it away, Thais.
Thank you, Monica. Good evening, everyone. Going to try sharing my screen one more time. Some of you were able to witness that. All right, Monica, just confirming.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Like Monica said, my name is Thais Fournier. I am a coastal resilience specialist at the Coastal Resources Center. We're also part of Rhode Island Sea Grant. This is we're housed at Narragansett URI. And we're a research and outreach organization dedicated to the sustainable management of coastal resources. And so our work as the Coastal Resilience Program involves providing technical assistance, capacity building initiative to the coastal communities of Rhode Island, as well as monitoring efforts for coastal climate impacts. So tonight we're going to be learning about how a municipal planner and a coastal restoration specialist are using these photos to improve coastal resilience in Rhode Island at this webinar. So I just want to remind everyone, if you're not already muted, or Georgia, I think you were able to mute everyone, just to mute yourselves. And then if you have any questions, we're going to give our first presentation, and then we are going to leave maybe a couple questions, depending on how long they are and how much time we have for Teresa, our first speaker. And then towards the end, we'll have questions for Wenley. But if anyone has questions that she can't get to, she was kind enough to say that she would respond afterwards, so I can collect the questions in the chat and we can go from there. So in Rhode Island, long-term records from our Newport tide gauge have shown that the local level has risen about 10 to 12 inches over the last century, and we are unfortunately expected to see another 12 to 19 in about 25 years. So having a way to visually document areas that are getting flooded helps us better prepare for the future. So what exactly is Mycoast? I won't steal a thunder for the rest of our speakers, but this is just kind of a broad overview. But essentially, it is a portal to collect and analyze pictures and data relating to coastal events. This information is collected through the Mycoast site, and it helps us visualize the impact of coastal hazards and enhance awareness, of whether it be the public, local decision makers, stakeholders, etc. And this is done using a smartphone. So since 2014, this is when we started, we have collected more than 4,000 reports, and these photos are linked to data about weather and tides, and also include damage reports. However, when we first started, it kind of began as documenting hotspots of coastal flooding, as we didn't really have the sophisticated flooding tools like we do today. And so by having Mycoast, it helped us understand essentially the lay of the land and document the chronic flooding impacts that were happening and that we're seeing happening more and more frequently. So through utilizing this Mycoast program, our hope for this is to really increase the knowledge of flood risks and impacts, as well as increase the capacity for communities for using this weather and climate information, and provide shoreline flooding data to be utilized by individuals in their decision-making, hence the reason for this webinar today. to let you know how our practitioners are using this sorts of data. So this is just an image of Bristol during a December 23rd storm in 2023. We had quite a big one. And this just gives you a picture that someone posted. And you can also scroll through areas in your neighborhood and click on the different icons that will show you either a storm report or a king tide report. But before I take too much time, I don't want to steal any more of the speaker's great presentation. So I'm going to introduce Teresa Crean, who is the Director of Planning, Building, and Resilience for Barrington, Rhode Island. She's also a former Coastal Management Extension Specialist alum at CRC. So welcome, Teresa, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to talk to us about how you actually use these Mycoast photos.
Great. Thank you, Thais, and thank you, Monica and Sea Grant, for putting on this webinar this evening. It's a pleasure to be here and share with you from my perspective as a municipal Director of Planning, Building, and Resilience for the town of Barrington, how Barrington has been using Mycoast and also CoastSnap, which I'll talk about in a minute, to catalog the flooding events that we've seen on our coastline. Since I started in Barrington, in January of 2022, there was a 3-foot storm surge on January 18th, 2022. Then there was a 3-ish plus a little bit of foot storm surge on December 23rd, 2022. And then another one in January of 2023. And then in the last few months, we had 3 major storm surge events, December 18th, January 10th, and January 13th, 2024. So this is not an issue that is going away, and we in Barrington are taking it seriously and trying to really understand how to move actions forward to address this flooding that we're seeing on a more regular basis locally. So I will go ahead and share my screen. I'm just diving right into it with our storm reports from Mycoast. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, so I want to first of all thank storm reporter Barbara L. Green. I think she's a resident in Barrington, and she's taken several photos. There are residents of town who have signed up to be storm reporters, and you all can do that too by just downloading the app and signing yourself up as a storm reporter. These images were taken, if you look at the image here to the right, this is looking across the Barrington River at the town of, the Barrington and Warren rivers at the town of Warren and the Warren waterfront from Barrington's coastline. So we have, this is the storm from December 18th, 2023, just about a week before Christmas. And the storm reports on Mycoast provide you with a tide chart to show the predicted and the actual observed tide for that day. It gives you all the weather information. It tells you that you're 0 hours and 13 minutes after high tide, and that geolocates you and sort of places you on a map to show where these photos were taken. If anyone is familiar with Rhode Island Storm Tools, it's a mapping software. We also did create a link to connect, Rhode Island created a link to connect over to Storm Tools. We want to see where this photo sits in the Storm Tools mapping. So this is a report from December 18th, 2023. We had January 10th, 2024, same location, same reporter. So we have a nice series here from the same intersection at the corner of Mathewson and Ferry Lane in Barrington. And then we have a third one on January 13th, 2024 at 9 a.m. at the same intersection. So we've got day and night and different angles, but the same flood envelope, a very similar flood envelope or inland extent of these floodwaters in this intersection in a residential neighborhood. So this is really good information for us as a town to start talking about what are we going to do? This is a town road. What can the town do to start thinking about how we manage this infrastructure, this roadway, this intersection, and then also the interface with the river systems that go through Barrington. So we're starting to have those conversations. Also from an emergency management perspective, how do we get cones out and how do we alert the public that there will be not only just localized flooding, but saltwater that they may or may not want to drive through for protecting their vehicles from saltwater corrosion on their vehicles. But we want to make sure that we have messaging that goes out for safety purposes and also thinking about our infrastructure. So those are the conversations that we've started to have in town. The NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has a great site called Tides and Currents. And this is how we know that what we're seeing on the ground matches the instrumentation or the data collection that's going on out in Narragansett Bay. We have several tide gauges throughout Narragansett Bay, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration provides this online, so you can get on tidesandcurrents.noaa.gov and put in your tide gauge. So I'm looking at the Kennebunk Light, Rhode Island. That's the one that's closest to Barrington. And then I put in a date range of December 18th, 2023, down to January 13th. So you can see the blue line is the predicted water level and the green line is the verified water level. So before NOAA verifies it, they actually have a red line that's the preliminary. So on the day of real time, you can get on the site and see how the red line is tracking, and the difference, this little call out box here shows you the difference of the predicted and the verified water levels. So this helps us understand that the tide gauge in Narragansett Bay is showing a 4-foot storm surge because it was predicted at 4.45 feet and the verified level is 8.47 feet. So that gives us the data that we need to say, we know that we know how high this storm surge was. And what is interesting about these three that took place December 18th, January 10th, January 13th was we really had no way to predict that this was going to happen. These were offshore storms. We had some notion that there was going to be a storm event, but to know that there would be a 4-foot or 3.5-foot storm surge, this isn't like a hurricane that's coming up the coast and we can all hunker down and get ready to go for these water levels. These happen pretty quickly. And we're trying to really grapple with, as a town, how we can do a better job, maybe get some sensors out there to give us a better handle on how to communicate these areas of localized flooding to the public. So I just wanted you all to know that we do have this data source that anybody can access to look at the water levels at our closest tide gauge. Barrington has several municipal parks that are coastal, and here are 2 examples. We have Latham Park, and we have a Coast Snap stationary phone cradle there. So you can, with Mycoast, you can go out and take pictures from wherever. But we also took advantage of an opportunity presented to us by Sea Grant and the Coastal Resources Center to install a static station for Coast Snap, which allows us to take one photo over time and be able to monitor a shoreline over time. So this is a picture of Latham Park on that January 13th storm surge. The water is usually not right here at the level of the base of the Coast Snap, but we had a 3.5-foot storm surge. So that's what this station looked like. The site, most of the park site was flooded that day in all 3 storms, actually. And over here on the right, we have our brand new bocce court and croquet court in Barrington that did experience some flooding. It recovered very well from that flooding, but here are some examples of recreational resources that withstood flooding in the last couple of months. Oops. And if anybody wants to play bocce or croquet, it's right here at Town Hall Government Center at the library, behind the library, if anyone's interested. So when you use Mycoast, one of the things that is really handy to know is how you can search for reports. When you get on the site, there is a button up top that says search reports, where you can enter in what kind of report you're looking for. I selected King Tide Storm Reporter. I selected Bristol County. I selected Barrington, Rhode Island, and it shows that in Barrington, we have 232 reports since the app launched back in 2014. So then you can scroll through these different reports and pull out the information you're looking for and be able to show some photos to decision makers, in my case, to boards and commissions for discussion of what can the town start to think about doing to take action in these areas. So as I mentioned in Latham Park, Barrington was one of the first communities that signed on to have a Coast Snap station, a static phone cradle that we take the same photo over time to show shoreline change. And it's a different way to think about how we record these flood conditions and also erosion and how our storm events changing our landscape over time. So there's also a potential for this to be used in research with the geologists, and to think about how we spend money more effectively at the local level to manage our landscapes and keep up with this coastal erosion that will come when you get a really big storm event that that hits our shore. So CoastSnap actually has a a cradle that, sorry, I'm went ahead too quickly, has a cradle, and it actually showed the sign that shows you, walks you through in the field. You don't have to register as a storm reporter or a Mycoast reporter to participate in CoastSnap. Anybody can do it on the fly in the moment and contribute that photo to our photo bank. So we have, I'll use the example here of Latham Park. This photo was taken back in 2021, and in 2021, 2022, we had a eroding shoreline. We had a lot of undercutting. There were old oyster shell beds that were basically dumped here from the oyster activities back in the day. And there was really not a lot of shoreline that was accessible, especially at a high tide like you're seeing here, for the public to access. So we were starting to talk to an engineer and working with Wenley at Save the Bay to come up with a design scheme to regrade this slope. As you can see, it's really, you know, has a really hard vertical edge here, and really you couldn't get from up here to down at the water beach level. There was some exposed, you know, metal and some old debris that was sort of washed up, and we wanted to clean it up and allow the public to have better access to the water here. So we started drawing up plans with a coastal engineer and talking with Wenley. But Mother Nature actually did the work for us. So we did not spend the money to get a grant and build this system, because on December 23rd, 2022, we had a big storm that completely regraded the landscape. So this is the before picture on October 9th, 2023. Wait, is that right? Yeah. It was 2022. Anyway, the before photo showing what this landscape looked like, and then all of the photos on the CoastSnap page shows you the time. All of these have a date associated with them, and there's actually a reel that plays on this on the CoastSnap page, and you can basically look at before and after the big storms come through. So we have some from October, we have some from December, so it's before and after these storms came through. So on December of 2023, you can see the vegetation has died back, and there's this sort of overwash area from the storm that came in and flattened out that slope that you saw in the first image. So again, this is an area that we likely will not invest funding to improve, because the public can now get safely down to the water's edge and enjoy the water's edge here. With that said, we discovered down here, a little bit south of this flat area, there's potentially some undercutting of the slope underneath this road, and there's erosion that's starting to advance toward the roadway. And with some grant funds that we had allocated for the original project, we're now pivoting a bit to apply those funds down to to think about how we can implement a solution for roadway support. So we were successful in getting design and planning funding from the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank to explore how we can do some sort of shoreline stabilization work in that undercutting of that road. So we're constantly adapting to these new conditions, and CoastSnap and Mycoast are allowing me as a municipal planning director to direct us in how we approach grants, how we work with partners like Wenley at Save the Bay, and address these problems as they evolve, and not waste taxpayer money on projects that don't need to happen. So with that, I'll end with this slide. I went through a lot of information quicker than I thought, but there's more time for questions. But I just end with another storm report from January 13th, 2024. This is a neighborhood on Anawamscut Road. And thank you to Elizabeth Staples for providing us with these reports. But again, this just reminds you that you have a tide graph here that shows you that there was a storm surge that day, and some photos showing, in this case, a residential neighborhood that has floodwater. So this is, again, there are many examples of this all across Barrington. And we are consistently, I did share the graph from the tides and currents site with our town council. Every month I have to write a report to town council for my department, and I did include images and that graph showing the December 18th, January 10th, January 13th graph to remind them that we really need to continue working on this. After this webinar, I'm actually walking 3 minutes over to the library, and we are hosting tonight a hazard mitigation and flood management plan 1-year review meeting with the public here in Barrington. Our hazard mitigation and flood management plan was adopted about a year ago. And we are required now every year to do a public review of where we are and how we're making progress. So we actually piggybacked this session. There's a Zoom being broadcast in the library auditorium right now with this webinar to our audience. So hi audience, we'll see you in a few minutes in person. And we are going to use this also to, think about how we characterize and capture some actions in moving forward with implementation of our hazard mitigation and flood management plan. So with that, I thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer questions that we have time for in this before Wenley gets on.
Great. Thank you so much, Teresa. That was a great presentation. We do have 2 questions that I think hopefully you'll be able to answer. I'll sort of combine them into one. The question is, do we know why in general tides are higher than expected on most days? And also they seem to be lower as well. So it's just more extreme.
In the Northeast, the way I understand it, there are 4 factors that feed into why the Northeast is seeing higher than expected tidal range. One is the melting of the terrestrial ice sheets. So that is contributing to sea level rise globally, but we do have a higher than global average in New England, in the Northeast. The second is the Gulf Stream and the way that water flows up the Atlantic coast and pushes up into the Northeast from the south. And there's a gravitational pull from the Greenland ice sheets. I can't speak intelligently on that, but one of the geologists from URI, I'm sure, could give you more information than you'd want on that gravitational forcing that's influencing how we experience tide levels. We also, in Rhode Island, I think there was a New York Times or NPR article on this very recently. We have what's called land subsidence in the Northeast along the Atlantic coast, where our land is shrinking, is settling, and and shrinking, I guess. So we have land that's rebounded after the last ice age, after the weight of those ice sheets retreated. The land popped back up, and now it's settling down, and so we have a couple millimeters a year of loss of elevation from land subsidence. And then thermal expansion of water is the other reason that we see it. So as the water's warm, the salt water expands and contributes to how, those are the 4 factors that I understand contribute to sea level rise. And if you'll recall, if you watch the weather reports this past year, we did have 100-degree water temperatures in Florida. And so the water temperatures in Florida were higher than we've seen. And that does, of course, impact how it flows up the East Coast. So we are always paying attention to how the water temperatures might affect our hurricane season. But hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you. And I have one other question for you. So you showed some of the photos that volunteers in Barrington have taken, both for Mycoast and also for CoastNap. Do you have any words of advice or things you'd love volunteers to do in terms of those photos?
I think just keep taking them. It's really helpful for us to have that time series. As you saw with me using Barbara Green's, I don't know if Barbara Green, I haven't met her yet, but if you're out there, hello, thank you for your photos. I think having that time series from one place, if people sort of adopt a place, I've been out at Walker Farm in Barrington and people have said, hey, are you a Mycoaster? So that's cool to actually know people are out there taking photographs. And I think if based on where you live in your area of the state, not just Barrington, obviously, but other areas of the state, if you kind of have an area that you've adopted just kind of keep going out there when we don't want anybody to get in harm's way. So that's the first rule of Mycoast, is no losses of anything. We want you to be safe when we're taking these photos. And actually, after a big storm passes, you can go out and take rack line photos of the debris line that's left behind. That's really helpful too, so we can see how far the debris is pushed inland and how far inland the waters have reached. So that's my word of advice is, please get as many people. I think this would be a great assignment for high school students, and get the next generation of Mycoasters contributing to our database, because the more photos we have, the more data we can, and the more real that this makes it for our residents who might not be fully convinced that this is a problem or this is an issue. And it also helps us really hone in on, we know what our exposure looks like. Okay, we know where the floodwaters are, but what are the impacts? Why does it matter? What do we need to do about it? And where does it make sense to spend municipal tax dollars and go after state and federal tax dollars to address some of these problems and minimize risk of loss?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Teresa. We all appreciate it. And I'll turn it over to you, Thais, to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Teresa. Well, everyone, my next speaker is Wenley Ferguson, who is the Director of Restoration at Save the Bay, and she works on habitat restoration, stormwater management, and coastal resilience projects within the municipal, state, and NGO partners in the Narragansett Bay watershed and South Coast. So Wenley, thank you for being here tonight, and I'll kick it over to you.
Sorry about that. Teresa was also part of this Mycoast team when she used to be at Coastal Resources Center. And thanks, Monica and Thais, for inviting us, and Pam Rubinoff, who's in the background, who has also been one of the leaders of this group over the years. So I'm going to share my screen and then go to from beginning. Here we go. So can you see my screen? I was going back this week to the land of Mycoast and trying to remember, when did we start the Mycoast photos, the actual app? And I found this one that was one of mine from 2016, Atlantic Ave in Westerly. And the marsh is to your left, and that is the roadway on probably just your typical sunny day king tide, or moon tide, larger moon tide. And what I found from my files prior to doing Mycoast, Pam, myself, and some other CRMC's coastal geologist, Janet Friedman at the time, we met to talk about how can we start documenting these flooding conditions that we're seeing regularly. And as Thais mentioned, this was before we had storm tools. This is before we had all of these sea level rise projection tools that are now at our fingertips. But back in 2010, that in 11, that wasn't available. So these flood tide photos were really kind of the window into what will come on a more regular basis. And these were just some I found from an earlier presentation from 2011 that we had taken of some of our sites that we monitor regularly around the state. So luckily, Teresa has covered a lot of stuff that I was going to talk about. So I'm going to talk more about how we use the photos for actual adaptation and restoration projects. And that's what I do at Save the Bay. I work in salt marsh restoration, but since about 2010, we've been working on what I've referred to as coastal adaptation or coastal resilience projects. So one of the things we do is using them to document where coastal habitats are going to migrate inland. This is a great example of a suite of photos from Marie Escobar over in Common Fence Point in Portsmouth, showing this low-lying ball field. Here's the backstop. Can you see my cursor? So here's the backstop over to the left, and this area is salt marsh, but it's being mowed, it's being managed as a field. And here you can see an aerial image with that. I could pick out from the the vegetation types, that there's a change from both the aerial, and then of course when you get on the ground you can actually see the salt marsh vegetation. This is all salt marsh vegetation growing around the backstop. A shrub called high tide bush is right here, so we know it's wet, but those images document that this floods regularly. And this is an area where the marsh can migrate inland in the future, and mowing is probably not the best activity, as you can see in this foreground photo. It without that robust vegetation, the marsh is getting stressed. And as Teresa mentioned, it's really helpful to have these photos. We know this area floods. We don't have to. There's nothing new to say that this is a low-lying area, but what's helpful is to get a sense of like the extent of flooding. These storms that we just had, the 3 storms within 3 weeks, the one on Saturday the 13th, at least based upon the Newport tide gauge, I think, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I think that had the highest recorded tide. I don't think the wave energy was as great. But it was just about a foot lower than Sandy. And it was, as Teresa said, we knew it was coming, but it was nowhere near the preparation as we were getting prepared for Sandy or Hurricane Irene. So here it is. It's another, the storm before was 3 or 4 days before that. And here we have even more significant flooding of this field area. So it's helpful to have images of these same sites over the years. We use these photos. This is a site in Tiverton at Fogland Point, clearly a vulnerable site. There's a road that crosses a barrier spit here. And we've been doing some dune restoration with the town of Tiverton, as well as looking for these little green polygons at the bottom of the image, or where we're actually within the next month going to be installing some areas for stormwater to be managed. And as we've been doing work out there, we're realizing that there's this some old impacts, human impacts in the wetland that we're going to modify. There's this was a skating pond, this rectangle where my arrow is, and we're going to do some modifications. And these flood tide photos, this is actually during one of the storms, so I should say storm photos, are highlighting in real time that we are predicting that this is a marsh migration corridor, but we're actually seeing it flood under these conditions. We're also seeing the impact of stormwater runoff during some of these photos, during some of these events as well. You can see the stormwater exacerbating the coastal flooding. Just 2 or 3 weeks later, here's the same site. This storm didn't have as much rain, but you could see how the tide height was even higher, and a little more flooding further inland. Going out on the beach, this is, as Teresa said, not the site you'd want to go out and take your photos of during the storm. This site where we've been restoring dunes, you can see a sequence of dune restoration photos above, and then here's the Martin Luther King storm of early 2022. The dunes held. It was only 6.3 feet. So your average king tide is about 5 feet. So this was about a little over a foot higher than your average king tide. But then that December 18th storm, there is not a sign of the dune, completely eroded with both the wave energy and the extra height of the tide. And my community partner was not posting these to Storm Tools. He got a video and he shouldn't have been there. When he texted me, I said, "How did you get these?" He said, "I drove foolishly." So we do not recommend you put yourself in harm's way to get these photos. You can get as much information after the fact from documenting where that high tide line occurred. Here's some sites, a site in Warwick where we use these photos, as Teresa said, to share with municipal partners. This is a photo going back to 2011 showing this low-lying road that floods. And here's another image in 2016 that we took of this roadway flooding. And we were able to meet with the municipal staff, fire, safety, police, and talk about the possibility of closing this road since no houses had frontage on it. And here's the same area in 2022. This is the old roadway, and it's been closed. This one property owner down here is trying to keep it open, even though they have access from a higher elevation. But it's the beginnings of steps to adapt to these changing conditions, and these photos are really helpful in sharing the information with our municipal partners as we're trying to identify and implement coastal adaptation projects. Over at India Point Park in Providence, this is an area that right down here where this path extended very close to the water's edge. This is the Seekonk River entering into upper Narragansett Bay, and the pathway was eroding. During a king tide like this, you had flowing water here right next to a public access path. This is an amazingly dangerous site. And so we worked with the city on getting funding to move the path inland. Here you can see where it was moved inland. And then we were able to do some restorative. They added fill behind the wall, and we did some restorative plantings, native salt tolerant plants. And that site's held pretty well. Now, to say the least, during these huge storms, we expect this site to flood. And we also know that there were sections of path that the city didn't have the funding to move inland at that time, back in 2019. And here is the rack from the one of the January storms. And you can see the path in the distance, it just disappears. So again, these photos help predict where we need to do, or help us plan where we need to do more work on these projects, since this type of adaptation work is hard. People don't like change, but we're going to have to make these changes slowly and regularly as we adapt to these rising sea levels. We use these photos also to assess other types of adaptation projects. This is a bank regrading project in Cranston, where the upper left photo shows the damage from Hurricane Sandy, where the very steep slope literally got cut vertically. And instead of trying to reinforce the bank at that steep slope, we worked with the city of Cranston and got them to agree to grading the bank back to make a more dissipative slope. And we got funding from one of our partners helping us with all of these coastal adaptation projects that a lot of them that I'm talking about that we did 10 years ago was funded through NOAA. And we worked with CRMC on these projects. And so here's our regraded slope. We were able to, we use these coconut fiber burritos, or in Cranston, our contractor called them cannolis. And because it was a more dissipative slope, we were able to cover them with soil and then plant native grasses. And these are warm season grasses, or switchgrass. And here's a little different perspective during the December storm, showing how the wave energy is hitting the base of that bank. And that's natural material. It has degraded since we did this 10 years ago. And we are using these photos to tell us, okay, under these conditions, we're expecting to see erosion, and we're going to be doing some adaptive management at the base of the bank. But the good thing is, it doesn't look, we didn't see the same amount of erosion because we did some form of retreat in that project in regrading. Some other projects where we use the photos to assess these past coastal adaptation projects, we call these end of road retrofits, where we found sites where roads end along the bay. This is Mill Cove in Warwick, and you can see the road is flooded. This was actually flooded due to just high water table. And we were able to remove about 150 feet of roadway and replant and enhance some public access to this site. and incorporate a small area for stormwater infiltration. And you can see this photo, it's a little blurry, that this was, I was out there almost at the height of the tide during that storm, but you can see the rack from the prior storms in December and January that extended almost all the way up to where we cut the roadway off. So this entire road would have been flooded if we hadn't removed it. And again, it helps us in identifying what type of maintenance do we need to do, working with our municipal partners post these large storm events. This was a much smaller road removal project in Warren. We didn't have much room to move the road inland, but the pavement was literally eroding into the Kickamuit River here. And so we removed a little bit of road, installed a little filter strip, did some shoreline stabilization and planting. And thanks to Connie McGreevy, she took these photos along the Kickamuit. Can't really tell where the road ends, and the entire area that we removed was flooded. And as Teresa said, you can go click on to see how this relates to the predicted sea level rise scenarios under storm tools, which is really cool. So you can take your photo that Connie took was taken right down here, this little blue icon, and you can see that under the light blue is 5 feet of sea level rise. The darker blue is 3 feet. So the area that she was documenting it is equal to about a little over 2.5 to 3 feet of sea level rise. So it also, you can ground truth some of these sea level rise projection maps as well with the photos that we're taking on the ground. Over in Warwick again, we worked with the city of Warwick for a number of years on a project to remove a section of an eroding road called Seaview Drive and pull this roadway back called Strand Ave, which flooded regularly. And Seaview Drive was both vulnerable to flooding and erosion. And so I'm just going to make a note. This is where a Mycoast photo was taken up here. So this work was just done in 2022. We planted dune grass in the spring of 23 after the pavement was removed. And here's the kind of an aerial image of it under construction. And then I was trying to figure out where this photo was taken the other night. This was taken on the northern side. It was taken up here, looking this way, looking south. So the entire roadway flooded up here. The storm tools for this image, here's where the photo was taken. And again, it's showing the vulnerability of this area a good deal inland. So these photos help us predict what some of these, in not just the smaller moon tides or just a foot of sea level rise, they're really giving us a window into what that 2050 scenario is going to look like and the vulnerabilities of some of these low-lying areas. By going out after the fact, you can also look at the damage caused by wave energy using these photos. This is a site in Bonnet Shores where we've talked to the Bonnet Shores Fire District about possibly removing this section of roadway because it's redundant. The houses access their driveways from the inland roads. And here's an image of a rack line going right up along the edge of the road, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And then here's a Mycoast image showing the damage from the December storm. And that is a vulnerable roadway, to say the least. And especially since it's not needed, there's a great opportunity for a future access enhancement and habitat restoration project. And remove that vulnerable infrastructure. Over on the Kickamuit River, we're working on a project with Bristol County Water Authority to remove 2 dams on the Kickamuit. It's actually underway right now. This lower impoundment is very low lying. And here is the dam that creates the lower impoundment. And this is showing tidal flooding from right to left of the saltwater flowing into that former reservoir. Bristol County Water abandoned the reservoir back in 2019. We have received funding and are working on actually removing this dam and restoring this tidal estuary. One of our colleagues, who's now a Mycoast reporter from Bristol County Water, took this image in December. The dam hadn't been removed here, but it looks like it had. There's no sign. There's the dam at low tide. There's just no sign of the structure. The water level was so high. So that highlights, again, the vulnerabilities and why we're trying to take steps to adapt to these changing conditions. In Narragansett, we worked with the town and the Land Conservancy to develop a management plan for their Middlebridge site, just on the east side of the Narrow River. And we've been working with them on moving their mow line inland to restore salt marsh habitat. And just this last spring and summer, they have started it was this summer, started a project to relocate the driveway, which is subject to flooding, and moving it inland to a higher elevation area. And this is the driveway today. This isn't a significant tide. It's only about your typical king tide elevation, 5.2 feet based upon the Newport tide gauge. But you can see the driveway flooding. So we're going to make the site a little more resilient by moving that roadway inland. But then take a look at what this whole area was like back in, what date was this? Oops, I can't see it with my image. I think it was January, one of the January storms. And that yellow building in the distance is one of those buildings at the Middlebridge site. The site is so vulnerable, over a foot and a half more water flooding this area, that the whole area is isolated. So it also is giving us, again, a window into a few decades out of how vulnerable some of these sites are. And I'm just going to cruise through these last two. This is Portsmouth, another vulnerable area where it's a public access fishing area owned by DEM. And this narrow spit is quite vulnerable to sea level rise or just coastal flooding today. We're working with them on a plan to limit vehicular access, but keep public access to the site. And here you can see the roadway, or a dirt road that goes out to that peninsula. There used to be a boat ramp out there. And here it is under a typical moon tide. There's the moon in the distance. And then here's a wonderful sunny day king tide photo showing about another half a foot, and the whole thing is isolated. And my last image is of Quaney, which is down in Charlestown, the Quanticottag Breachway. We've been working with the Department of Environmental Management on a plan to move the access road inland and move some of the parking away from the breachway. And this is very close to the open ocean. And a very hardy, his name got cut off, Kent Crutler was out during one of these storms, and you could see the ocean in the distance. And this is not just flooding, but this is surge. And so that's the area that we're proposing to move that parking inland. You can see why, because of this significant vulnerabilities to flooding. And that's the upper parking area that was completely flooded during the storm. And just to highlight that, those the tide information that Teresa shared, as you saw, you could go today and look at what the water levels were predicted, being the blue line, versus observed. And the great thing about the Mycoast tool is that it does it for you. So in this case, it didn't show up on the Mycoast tool, so I went and got it myself. So I just wanted to highlight, lots of volunteers work with us on these projects, and a lot of the projects that I highlighted today were funded in part with NOAA dollars. And I thought this was, I noticed, I don't know if Monica and Thais and Pam noticed this one. Here's a new way to recruit Mycoast volunteers. Have your smart doorbell, your Ring doorbell, take photos. Diane Quaka over at Great Island in Point Judith, this was during one of the January storms, and you could see her road was flooding. And that was a Ring, probably a Ring doorbell photo. So many innovative ways to take pictures. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Wenley. We really appreciate that. We have a couple of questions. You might be able to answer this one. Someone was asking whether or not some of the issues with flooding are because of cumulative soaking of the ground. And you had mentioned that stormwater has been exacerbating coastal flooding. So I didn't know if you could speak to this idea of the ground being saturated and if that was having an impact after all these storms.
It was interesting, these storms, because there was, the December storm and actually in the second January storm, of course, we were having inland flooding as well. And I know some of those areas in Warwick, the water table was so high, it was definitely exacerbating the coastal flooding. And it's interesting, I noticed that on the Mycoast tool, more people are starting to take pictures of the inland flooding, which I think is another future opportunity for Mycoast, is looking not just at tidal events, but also riverine flooding events. And, you know, stormwater runoff in these low-lying coastal areas can definitely exacerbate flooding, localized flooding. But of course, those large events, it's the tidal surge itself that is causing the majority of the flooding.
Great, thank you. And we had a question that someone submitted ahead of the webinar. Thais, I don't know if you could speak to this, or Wenley. I have some thoughts, but if you may have better ones. So the question was, are there parameters for picture taking or perimeters for picture taking? Is it acceptable to take photos of a neighbor's flooded property if you don't have their specific permission?
That's an interesting question. I wouldn't mind hearing from others. I'm always cognizant when I'm taking a photo that I'm trying to get a photo of some type of public property as well. And the reality is you're going to get some private property in the mix. But I'm not trying to aim my camera at someone's house taking a photo of it flooding, for example. So that will,
sorry, Wenley, I'll jump into, I had, myself and both Pam had reached out to some contacts to verify that information. So we're waiting on the response to give like an official answer for, like, I guess, you know, private residences and legal rights. So we'll follow up with that answer once we get something concrete. But that's a very good question and a good point to make as well. And someone in the chat mentioned that you can take photos as long as you're not actually trespassing on someone's property. And I think it would be fair to say that if someone had a complaint about a photo that appeared in our database, you know, you could reach out to us. We aren't looking to include photos that people have issues with sharing. So I don't see any other questions. Does anyone else have any last questions? Any of our presenters have any final thoughts they'd like to share before we sign off?
I did see something about where to take photos and how. I think as Teresa said, if you have a spot that you can kind of take some regular photos and there's a clear reference point and you use that reference point, it really is helpful to go back out to the same location. The other thing that we as a team have tried to do, and I could do a better job at it, is provide locations of some of these adaptation sites that we would love to have information as to how they're responding. Because just because we've done one of these projects, nothing's one and done. You have to go back and adaptively manage the site and maintain it. So it's helpful for us to have that documentation. And then also going out again after a storm and trying your best to get that rack line, you know, within a few days. It's still very apparent before the town might come out and sweep up the material. So but that's another good way after a larger storm event to go out and document where the tide was. And maybe in the comments section, just note, you know, make some notes about it, because it sometimes they're a little harder to pick up in a photograph.
Okay. I had one other question actually for you, Wenley. You had mentioned marsh migration, and specifically with that ball field that is in Portsmouth. Can you speak a little bit more about why marsh migration is important? What's happening to the marshes as they're trying to move inland?
So in our region, we don't have a huge, large areas for the salt marshes to migrate, just because of, even if we didn't have any coastal development, Narragansett Bay and the salt ponds have steeper terrain adjacent to them, and there's topography. So where there are low-lying areas like that site in Common Fence Point or Sepauwett over in Tiverton, where the marsh has an area that has a low-lying slope that's undeveloped to move inland. As that tidal inundation keeps creeping inland, those salt-tolerant plants will just move with it. And I have a whole presentation on marsh migration. You can see salt-tolerant, you can see signs of die-off of the upland species along this edge, and you can see the salt marsh grasses growing underneath the canopy of oak trees in some places. Those oaks have deep roots, so they're getting the groundwater that they need, but the herbaceous plants are dying off and converting to salt tolerant plants, being salt marsh grasses. So using these images to kind of show where that water level is moving inland, and also the plants also tell us where the marsh is wanting to migrate, it is helpful. And we've done projects over in Tiverton, and the project that Teresa mentioned in Barrington at Walker Farm, where we start planting more salt tolerant plants. We like worm season grasses, and we've, in the case of Walker Farm, which was a highly manipulated site, we removed rubble along the shoreline to make a more gradual slope so that marsh has the ability to migrate inland and not hit a hard edge. So that's a little bit about it. It's happening. If you like it or not, it's going to happen. Salt tolerant vegetation is going to move inland, but we're trying to give it a path because the salt marshes have such great value for so many reasons, including wildlife habitat.
Great. And we have Kathy has the last question, but I'll just mention a couple of people are asking about salt tolerant plant species and more about salt marsh migration. Wenley, is there a link on the Save the Bay website they can check out that will tell them a little bit more about this?
So for salt tolerant plants, CRMC has a great plant list on their website. And salt marsh migration, I don't have a presentation that's up on the website, but stay tuned. We do have some, if you go to our website, we have an art of some of our old newsletters who have articles about salt marsh migration. And
Great.
we always are doing presentations in the community.
Great, thank you. And then Kathy, your question?
Wenley, when you see these floodings in residential areas, how are the residents accommodating not being able to get out of the road or out of their driveways?
That's a good question. I mean, those storms that we just had, those 3 storms, and looking at pictures from Common Fence Point, people were isolated. And you know, that's just the nature of these low-lying areas. There's nothing you can do during those events other than try to prepare for them. But the challenge with these events coming more frequently and without a lot of notice, there's, I think, as Teresa mentioned, we more information getting out to municipalities that there is a chance of coastal flooding so that they can start to put out, traffic notices for people in low-lying areas, as well as, making sure people realize that these areas are not suitable for flooding. I was out at Conimicut Point that morning of January 13th, and people are driving through water that is up to, like, big trucks are driving through water and they have no idea how deep it is. And cars can get stuck and people can, let alone the damage to your car, but it's more loss of life and limbs. So, and these sites are, this is happening just so much more frequently that it would be great for each of these municipalities to have a clear plan when these events come, and more notification. Because I was just surprised on a Saturday morning during that last event how many people were driving through salt water with no understanding of what was going on. And luckily, I did see a few cars stuck, but luckily, no one was in significant harm's way that day.
I saw a presentation about flash flooding and how you get out of your car if you get stuck in one of those situations. It was on the net. Within the last couple of days, it was a major reporter who they actually set up with a car, and they had to tie a tie to the car so that the car wouldn't disappear, but you could see it get further and further down in the water. He blasted out of the window and climbed onto the roof and showed how to do it. It was pretty scary, but what we're talking about probably requires us to know that.
And especially in precipitation area events as well. So
thank you, everyone. That brings us to time. So, it sounds like another topic for future webinar for sure, or potentially many more. So thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you so much again to Wenley Ferguson of Save the Bay, Teresa Crean of the town of Barrington, Thais Fournier with Coastal Resources Center in Rhode Island Sea Grant, and Georgia Young with Rhode Island Sea Grant. And thank you to Pam Rubinoff, who's been answering questions in the chat. We will be sending out the recording of this to everyone who has registered. Please feel free to share it with anyone who wasn't able to join us tonight. Thank you so much, and I wish you all a good night.